During a quiet day in Pompo Hills, a young sorcerer named Seth leaps from the rooftops. After admiring the splendor of the city, Seth goes to visit his young friend, Tommy, to perform some of his magical spells. Seth arrives and exposes his collection of magical books, which had been taken without his master's permission. Despite Tommy's warning of possible punishment, Seth persists. Seth tries to perform a spell from the booklet, but nothing works. Embarrassed, Seth uses his own original move, Titan Punch. However, he knocks a massive boulder onto a nearby farm, upsetting the demon-like cows. The cows begin a stampede, chasing the two boys into the city. Meanwhile, Alma has trouble buying supplies from a local store. They refuse to serve a sorcerer, but Alma threatens them into giving her supplies. In the next instant, she notices a commotion and her apprentice Seth escaping a stampede of cows. Alma uses her magical powers to stop the rampage by bringing the cows into line. She scolds Seth for causing trouble again and threatens to punish him. Alma is suddenly struck with a rock, and the villagers demand the sorcerer's leave. Tommy is also scolded for hanging around infected people. Alma and Seth fly away on her broom before the situation escalates. Confused, Seth asks why the villagers rejected Alma when all she tried to do was help. She explains that most people reject sorcerers no matter what. Seth is punished by being forced to clean Alma's floating house. Seth asks why people look down on amazing people like sorcerers. Alma explains that sorcerers are considered just as dangerous as the Nemesis and gets struck by a headache from her curse. Later that night, Seth reads more about the Nemeses and believes that he must defeat the Nemeses by becoming a powerful sorcerer. The next day, he practices more spells and utterly fails again. Seth says he'll prove everyone wrong by becoming a Nemesis hunter. As they discuss the mysterious Nemesis, an egg falls from the sky and crashes into the village. Alma is out hunting another Nemesis, so Seth decides he must fight it on his own. While Tommy warns the villagers, Seth arms himself with several of Alma's magical tools. Seth arrives shortly before the egg cracks, and the giant-like Nemesis hatches. He tries to defeat the monster with brute force using the magical items, but he's easily overpowered by the large beast. Tommy rushes to his friend's aid, but ends up putting himself in danger. The Nemesis attacks the young boy, but Seth puts his body on the line to protect him. After letting Tommy escape, Seth is in danger of being squashed, but Seth remains determined to prove himself in this fight so that the people watching can believe in sorcerers. Suddenly, the Nemesis is struck by a spell called Bravery Destroyer. Suddenly, more sorcerers appear, and they commend Seth for his bravery. The Bravery Quartet works together to bind the Nemesis, and they introduce themselves as the Bravery Quartet. They announce to the town that they're going to save the people from the Nemesis as long as they listen. Seth asks to fight with the other sorcerers, and Don Bossman agrees to take him on due to his bravery. The villagers claim Seth will never be of any help and demand he leave. However, the boss reveals the wings on his head and says he and Seth are both sorcerers alike. Don Bossman evacuates the citizens and asks Seth to drive away the Nemesis. Seth intends to defeat himself, and the boss encourages him not to use brute force. He appears to entrust the task to Seth and leaves with the townspeople. The Nemesis is freed from the sealing spell, and Seth attempts to attack it with Titan Punch, but fails. The Nemesis chases Seth across town, much as the cows did the day before. Seth's strikes are useless against the monster's soft body, and he recalls the bossman's advice. Meanwhile, Tommy finds his father at the bank when the Bravery Quartet appears and orders everyone to leave. Back at the fight, Seth follows the boss' advice and restrains the Nemesis with a long chain. The Nemesis gets furious and launches a magical beam, which appears to destroy the town. Elsewhere, Alma flies on her broom after learning the Nemesis she was called to deal with was just a cow. On her way back home, she notices the Nemesis's aura and rushes toward the incident. She begs Seth not to do anything rash. In the decimated Pompo Hills, Seth survives the monster's massive beam and notices screaming coming from the bank. The Bravery Quartet ties up Tommy and the townspeople. They were planning on robbing the bank while the town was in crisis. While Seth is dealing with the Nemesis, they're stealing money from the citizens. Seth arrives at the bank and appears horrified by the situation. Don Bossman thanks him for helping in making a fortune, and the citizens believe Seth was in on the whole operation. The boss reveals that the Bravery Quartet is a group of treasure hunters taking advantage of the Nemesis problem. Seth realizes he's been tricked all along, and the boss says there's no use in fighting for regular people. Despite Seth's struggles, people remain ungrateful and hate him. The boss tries to convince Seth that he should only fight for himself, not the people who hate sorcerers. The Bravery Quartet tries to make up for Seth before leaving, but the young sorcerer punches the boss through the wall. Seth engages the other quartet members, but Gigi blocks him with his magic. The boss spares Seth and tries again to convince him that he's right about normal people. Seth refuses to accept he's on the same level as the thieves. The Bravery Quartet leaves the citizens tied up, and the Nemesis arrives to kill them all. Tommy and the others can only watch as they're about to die. Seth gets up and promises not to leave Tommy behind. He faces the Nemesis blast alone, determined to prove he wants to be an amazing sorcerer who protects everyone. The Bravery Quartet looks on from afar, amazed to find that Seth is protecting all the people using his bare hands. Seth saves everyone inside the bank by shielding them from the Nemesis's blast. Using magic barehanded, Seth defeats the monster using his powerful Titan punch, or so it appears. The Nemesis narrowly survives, but its injured body is suddenly destroyed by Alma's skull attack. She asks Seth to rest for now and takes him back to her house. That night, Seth awakens to his body being covered in bandages. Alma treated his wounds and even caught the Bravery Quartet on her own. She scolds Seth for using his magic barehanded and warns him about the Inquisition. She believes the villagers may have contacted them, but Seth believes they're grateful for the help. Tommy handed Alma the remains of Seth's gloves and thanked her for saving them all. Despite this, Alma feels that normal people and sorcerers would never understand each other. Seth claims that finding the Nemesis nest is his best bet for destroying all of them. Alma reveals that there is a rumor that the Nemesis net is called Radiant. Seth determines he has to destroy Radiant so that sorcerers are no longer considered as villains. That night, Alma recalls finding Seth 10 years ago. Her earliest memory is her awakening after losing her memories following a fierce attack. She was found with Seth, who she also had no recollection of. After that, Alma's journey to find herself began. Alma tried for a long time to find people who knew of her past life or Seth's. However, no matter where she went, no one knew who they were. She was cursed with unusually powerful headaches, and she figured out that she had survived an attack with a Nemesis. She took Seth along because he was the only clue toward her past. Around the time Alma began making a name for herself as a Nemesis hunter. One day, Alma went far away to hunt Nemesis and left Seth alone. Seth was bullied for being infected and accidentally lashed out against other kids. As a result, the villagers tried to burn him, but luckily Alma came back in time and managed to scare away the angry villagers. Following this incident, Alma realized it was up to her to raise Seth as a proper sorcerer. Rather than searching for herself, she decided to find a place where she could protect Seth. Alma got her floating home and sailed across the sky where no one could bother them, even if people continuously ran them off. The next morning, Seth tries to get out but gets caught by Alma. She knows he wants to go on a journey to destroy Radiant. He has no plan but a lot of spirit, so Alma doesn't stop him. She provides him certain tools, such as his own broom and fresh gloves. Alma also makes him promise not to become a monster. Before Seth leaves, he turns around to thank Alma once more for everything she has done for him. As Seth leaves on his new broom, even the stone-cold Alma is moved to tears. Seth flies over town, and even the villagers wave goodbye to the young sorcerer. A researcher, by the name of Doc, from Artemis Institute approaches Alma's observatory. In his approach, he asks Alma if she knows where the remains of the golem Nemesis are located. Alma complains that she placed a call into the Artemis Institute 3 days ago, with Doc insisting that he had instructed his assistant to head to the Pompo Hills ahead of his arrival and make preparations. The researcher expresses bewilderment, believing his assistant to have gotten lost yet again. Meanwhile, an Inquisitor ship led by Captain Dragonoff is revealed to have captured a sorceress and is still on the search for more. Concurrently, the Inquisitors also try to arrest Seth, who continues to resist on board their ship. Dragonoff asks what the commotion is about, and his knights explain that Seth crashed into the ship. They tried to interrogate him, and he started a fight in retaliation. Dragunov notices Seth's horns and asks if he is a sorcerer. He reveals that inquisitors exist to prosecute sorcerers, and his men arrest Seth. They imprison him in a black-silver cage, and Seth orders them to release him so he can hunt Radiant down. Dragunov warns Seth not to use that term so loudly, and they imprison him on the ship for being cursed. Seth regrets not listening to Alma properly. He was told to head to the town of Artemis and find a sorcerer named Yaga who might have an idea about Radiant. Inside the ship, Seth notices a small floating creature and a girl also trapped beneath the ship. She introduces herself as Melly and reveals she was going to Pompo Town to retrieve a Nemesis before she got lost and captured by the Inquisition. She is a sorceress sent from Nemeses and is accompanied by her small friend Mr. Boobry. Melly was caught after becoming separated from her friend Doc. She compliments Seth's horns, but they are interrupted by a sudden shaking on their ship. Doc arrives, and Melly notices him and quickly blows his cover. Dragunov catches Doc carrying Nemesis remains and arrests him as well. Back inside the ship, Seth introduces himself to Doc and learns Melly is his assistant. Doc claims he researches Nemesis because taking them out one by one is a monumental task. Seth claims he's going to defeat them all using Radiant, and Doc learns Alma is the woman who raised him. Mr. Boobry steals the keys to free all of the sorcerers. They try tracking down their stuff before escaping, but Dragunov catches them. Seth uses his Titan punch to blow them away, and Dragunov is shocked to see him use magic with his bare hands. The knights persist, and Melly protects them using her defensive magic. Seth is impressed with Melly's defensive magic. They appear to get overwhelmed again when suddenly Melly changes personalities and goes on the offensive. When Melly is under extreme stress, her curse activates, and her personality changes to the reverse of her typical kind self. Melly's crazy, mean side destroys the knights with Igni's Rumper. Seth feels amazed by her power and gets all of his stuff back. Dragunov suddenly appears and threatens to shoot Melly with his bow when Seth uses his Titan punch to free Doc's ship. The sorcerers escape, and as the knights are ready to shoot down their ship, Dragunov orders them to stop fighting as they get closer to Artemis. He also makes a mental note of Seth using magic barehanded. As the sorcerers soar through the sky on Doc's ship, Seth asks Melly to teach him more about magic. Before long, they reach the city of sorcerers, Artemis Academy. After escaping the clutches of the Inquisition, the trio of Melly, Doc, and Seth land in the Artemis Institute's docking station. As they pass through a series of checkpoints, Seth remarks in awe as he observes the vast number of sorcerers that occupy the city. However, before he can progress any further, Melly informs him that he must register as a civilian to be able to use any of the city's facilities. Despite his dislike of the proposal, Doc forces Seth to register. Doc advises Seth to move quickly lest he miss the admission ceremony. The researcher insists on staying behind, but Seth snatches him and runs to the ceremony. The group arrives just as the ceremony begins. Master Lord Majesty, the institution's founder and sole ruler, is introduced by one of his devoted followers. In the opening, Seth recognizes Lord Majesty as the yellow cat Alma warned him of. Master Lord Majesty is polite in his welcome speech to the aspiring sorcerers, informing them of the Artemis Institute's ultimate purpose of eliminating the curses that plague all sorcerers. Seth and the other sorcerers on stage fill out the paperwork to award them citizenship at Lord Majesty's request. This turns out to be a skillfully concealed trick, as the short letter that was signed quickly breaks down, revealing an extensive list of additional restrictions and conditions. For simply using the Institute's paper and ink, all of the sorcerers on stage are immediately in debt. Doc is overjoyed as his true intention is revealed. Doc reasoned that getting Seth to sign up as a citizen would keep the horned boy so distracted with debt that he would not have time to interfere with Doc's social life. His plan backfires when an Artemis official arrives to inform him that Seth registered Doc as a guardian, meaning that all debt made by Seth is now officially Doc's responsibility. Regretting his failure to pay attention to Alma's warnings of Lord Majesty, Seth plans to immediately locate Yaga and continue his quest without paying his debt, much to Doc's disapproval. Despite Doc's pleas, Seth and Melly wander randomly through the Artemis Institute in trying to find Yaga. The duo search all around the city, each time leaving behind immense property damage and causing an elevation to the amount of debt accrued, much to the horror of their guardian. After a long day of work, the trio sit near a park to rest. Civilians walk by, welcoming Doc as the new debt king, the person holding the most debt in the entire institution. They interrupted by the strange man in his cauldron. The strange, elderly man suggests that he may know the location of the mysterious Yaga. Suddenly, the Artemis Institute's alarm system sounds. The Inquisition is approaching the city, intent on capturing Seth, Melly, and Doc for their escape the previous day. A swarm of numerous sorcerers surrounds the city, barricading and preventing the Inquisition from moving ahead. In the following minute, an Inquisitor soldier runs to the deck, alerting the vice captain of strict orders to retreat. Captain Dragunov adds that this is the result of Artemis using its resources well. Dragunov reveals that the Institute wields both political and military power, as it houses members of the 13 Sorcerer Coven. He warns that even one member is powerful enough to defeat 1,000 Inquisitor soldiers. Once the Inquisitors are pushed back, the elderly man goes back to explaining, using the encounter as one of many examples of the Artemis Institute's means of protecting sorcerers. He goes on to ask Seth what the teen boy plans to do once he meets Yaga. Seth explains his ambition to get strong enough to locate and destroy Radiant, to which the elderly man rejects it as a pipe dream. The horned sorcerer remains adamant in pursuing his goal, despite the odds. Impressed, the man in the cauldron states that Seth was able to pass the first test. Confused, Seth questions if this man will finally take him to meet Yaga, to which the elderly sorcerer finally makes it clear he is Yaga. Later on in the day, Dragunov is revealed to have met with the Inquisitor General to explain his findings. The captain informs the general that he had encountered a sorcerer with horns who could use magic barehanded. Alarmed, the general informs Dragunov to keep this entire matter confidential and to keep tabs on Seth and his friends. As Dragunov leaves, another hooded figure arrives, and the two make it clear Seth is too dangerous to be left free and must be captured. Melly wakes up early and shows her optimism for the day to her cardboard dolls. Her peaceful morning routine is abruptly broken when Seth's screaming can be heard from afar. The sorcerer clumsily crashes through her window. Seth declares that he needs Melly's aid learning how to utilize magic. He goes on to say that in order to be worthy of Yaga's instruction, the senior sorcerer requires him to successfully conjure up a basic offensive magic, such as the meteor drops technique. While she would love to help, Melly can only use offensive magic during one of her fits, as it is her second persona's area of expertise. Melly gently admits that in her regular form, she can only utilize defensive magic. But she has someone else in mind who may be able to help with his goal. In a short period of time, the duo locates the perfect candidate, Doc. Doc is at the Kettle Coffee, a cafe owned by his sweetheart, Miss Melba, when they arrive. As Seth and Melba become acquainted with one another, Doc is busy fantasizing about Miss Melba, although the fantasization is abruptly interrupted by an angry Mr. Melba Papa, who smashes a platter on Doc's face. As a token of apology and gesture of friendship for Papa Melba's continued harassment, Melba treats the trio of sorcerers to a free meal. Seth goes on to explain his desire to find Radiant and his need to learn offensive magic in order to pursue that goal. To that end, the teen explains that as per Melly's suggestion, Doc may be able to help. Initially, Doc is dismissive of the idea, believing Radiant to be a mere fairy tale and not having a single interest in helping Seth with anything. Miss Melba interrupts, stating her admiration in Doc's presumed willingness to help in the effort. She showers him with praise, changing Doc's tune and prompting him to immediately begin tutoring Seth with the effort of impressing the woman further. In celebration, Miss Melba brews up a few cups of her special tea. After drinking a few disgusting cups, Doc uses the excuse of having to help Seth train to flee the scene and avoid drinking any further. At the training field, Doc expresses his desire to make his agreement a one-time deal. Instead of sparring with Seth or using magic himself, he will simply read the instructions from a grimoire. Following along with Doc's reading, Seth begins to feel out the form of the Fantasia in the surrounding area and hopes to gather enough to invoke the meteor drop spell. Each attempt is a resounding failure, prompting Seth to try even harder. In the last try, Seth is finally able to conjure up a wealth of Fantasia, but it ends up backfiring, exploding before he can even form it for a spell. The eruption of Fantasia is potent enough to catch Doc in the crossfire and sends him blasting in recoil. The group later regathers back at the Kettle coffee shop, with the mummified Doc licking his wounds. Despite Melly's pleas, the researcher is determined to never help Seth again. Melly's curse is triggered in the following minute, prompting her to enter into one of her infamous fits. Without saying anything further, Melly launches into a rage, unleashing innumerable bolts of Fantasia via the Meteor Drops spell. In Melly's carnage, she blasts Doc, sending the researcher flying off into the distance. Meanwhile, Seth begins to run, hoping to evade direct combat with an enraged Melly that is in hot pursuit. The sorceress is able to land a direct hit with one of her blasts, sending Seth rocketing off in recoil. The debris during the explosion partially rips Seth's feather gloves in the process. Melly is so focused on beating the instructions into Seth's head that she is unaware of the bridge collapsing above her. The sorcerer instead places all of his hope on one final attempt for the meteor drops. Remarkably, the spell is able to be done successfully, destroying the rubble and saving Melly from the impact. With his success, Seth goes to embrace Melly, who immediately reverts back to her normal state after showing delight in Seth's affection. He goes on to thank Melly, letting her know that her aggression is the main reason he was able to successfully conjure the Meteor Drops spell. Later on in the day, the group goes to meet Yaga, where Seth is able to successfully show off his usage of Meteor Drops. Yaga criticizes his ability to gather Fantasia, but is impressed with the boy's improvement. The Elder Sorcerer immediately shoots down Seth's excitement, making it clear that he was still far from being ready to track down Radiant. He explains that many of the world's most notable sorcerers have tried in the past, and not even a single one has come close to accomplishing that goal. As a final test to gauge Seth's worth, Yaga leaps into the air and delivers a mighty beam of Fantasia. The cauldron crash. Remarkably, Seth is able to block the incoming spell, securing his spot as Yaga's official student. The next morning, Melly wakes up and greets her cardboard friends. Her daily routine is disrupted yet again when Seth breaks through her open window and begs for a place to stay. Sleeping in the park, as he had been, increases his debt and Doc's as his guardian. Melly agrees, allowing Seth to use her spare room. She expresses her joy at having a roommate as Seth questions the cardboard dolls Melly has in her room, to which she replies that they are her friends. Soon later, Seth begins training with Yaga, who attacks him while chasing him. Seth cannot even dodge properly and is knocked out cold by a pot beam. Later that day, Doc's peaceful morning that he spends admiring Melba is interrupted by Seth and Melly. He tries to shoo them away, but Melba interrupts him to ask if he would like to try her new coffee recipe. Doc knows how horrible Melba's original recipes are, but he still accepts them, thinking that she will like them if he takes the offer. Doc tries it and is shocked to find that it actually tastes good. Doc takes a moment to celebrate how his life is finally turning around for the better. The sewer hole near him opens up, and an octopus tentacle throws him into the sewer. Yaga reveals that it is a devil fish called Kraken. The water system beneath them is where sorcerers dump animals from experiments, and this particular species likes coffee. Melba's father says that Doc reeks of coffee from drinking it all the time. Therefore, this monster may actually eat him. Seth and Melly panic on hearing this. Inside the sewers, Doc awakens to find the monster drinking his coffee and thinks he will be eaten. But then suddenly, it is attracted to the strong scent of coffee. It heads towards its source, which is actually a giant bucket of coffee that Seth and Melly have brought along to lure it out. Yaga told them to take care of it alone and for Seth to consider it part of his training. The Kraken appears, and they are relieved to see that Doc is still alive. Unfortunately, Seth's Titan punch doesn't hurt it, as the Kraken is too soft and squishy. The Kraken suddenly grabs the coffee bucket and starts running away. Seth and Melly try to attack it, but it squirts some ink on them and makes them crash into each other. The creature escapes, and Seth is forced to retreat. Later, they decide to try and stop the Kraken from moving using traps. The first trap only ends up capturing Doc, and an even more dangerous trap does as well. Melly's last plan is to use an arrow with a sleeping potion on the tip, but that just ends up hitting Doc too. This infuriates Melly, and her switch is flipped. She attacks the creature, but is not of much use, and they are back at the cafe, battered and bruised. Yaga appears to ask if they are ready to quit, since fighting a creature on its own turf is quite difficult. But Seth refuses to just give up and let Doc die. The two head back down with another bucket of coffee, but Doc surprisingly tells them to just leave. Doc is frustrated that Melba won't give him the time of day and has decided to live the rest of his life with his new friend he named Devil. Seth then shockingly pours the coffee on himself, but Doc is frightened that Devil will surely eat Seth. Devil does eat him, but Malia explains that that was his plan. The coffee he poured on himself was filled with powerful spices, so Devil ends up spitting Seth out. With it weakened, Melly is able to stop its movement, which allows Seth to land an attack. Seth goes in for another strike, but Doc begs that he stop. He explains that he and Devil bonded over their love for coffee and are now friends. Seth wants them all to be friends together, and Doc agrees, as he can't believe how reckless Seth was to save him. The next day, as they are hanging out at the cafe as usual, Seth remarks that he now knows how weak he is, and Yaga pops up just then to tell him to get ready to train again. Later, Seth continues training but ends up destroying his gloves. Yaga decides to take the gloves but gives Seth another pair. These are quite different, as Yaga explains that they prevent the wearer from using magic at all and shock him if he tries to take them off. Yaga has decided that Seth isn't worthy of his instruction, as he is now and points out how he has never seen such crude and careless use of Fantasia. Seth points out that being able to gather absurd amounts of Fantasia just means he is powerful, and the more power he has, the better. Yaga explains that gathering power isn't a bad thing, but true ability lies elsewhere. He tells Seth that he has been so focused on becoming powerful that he has forgotten something crucial, and the new gloves are not to come off until he finds the answer. Seth is furious, and he complains about the cryptic things the pot wizard said about true power lying somewhere other than magic. Soon, Doc comes running there, and it seems that Melba has started feeling his riz a little. She asks him to try some herbal tea, but he replies that they don't have time today, as Majesty has sent them an invitation. The invitation is to explain that their debt has soared to unprecedented heights, and is by far the highest debt in the history of Artemis Academy. Doc must explain to Seth that this isn't something to celebrate, and then must tell Lord Majesty that they have no money to pay the debt. Lord Majesty has them do tasks instead, and Seth wishes he could use magic to make things easier. Doc works hard as well, as he thinks about Melba and their bright future together. Just then, Melly notices something in the sky, and Seth goes to investigate. We see that it's the Bravery Quartet, and Don explains that his genius is what allowed him to discover the treasure that they are about to get. Seth arrives. They are shocked to see each other, but Seth forgot who they are. They reintroduce themselves and explain that escaping the island's prison was easy. Melly comes there running, and she gets embarrassed on seeing them in just underwear. Seth tells her that they are a bunch of thieves who are here to raid the Academy's storehouses. Melly attacks them with a meteor drop and tells the surprised Seth that she has been practicing so that she doesn't have to rely on her other personality that often. Next up, Don and his men shoot magic fart missiles at her, and she blocks them before realizing that their underwear is made of the same material as gloves, which enables them to use their magic. Don affirms as he shoots. The fart bombs again and Melly counterattack. It is useless, as their shield user can block all their attacks, and Don laughs as he realizes that Seth can even use magic right now because of the black-silver gloves. He offers to take those gloves off of him if he pretends that he didn't see anything here. But Seth refuses to make a deal with him. Don says that's a shame because he holds Seth in high regard now. He's impressed by his bravery and the powerful punch that can defeat a monster in one hit, and that is why he pities that his power has been sealed off. Don says that power is everything in the world, and the strong deserve everything. Seth yells at him and claims that while power is important, he will never use it the way they do. He claims that he will defeat them without magic, and Don decides to finish him off with a combo attack from the Brave Quartet. Their fart magic hits its mark, but luckily, Crazy Millie is out to deal with it. Jiggy stops part of her attack with a troublesome shield, but Seth tells her to attack again. Seth then surprisingly uses her attack to go airborne and lands a kick on Dawn. Gigi is taken out as well, but Dawn wakes up to capture Melly. Boobry desperately attacks Dawn, forcing him to fall, and Seth instantly springs into action, but Melly cries for him to stop as he isn't able to fly a broom without magic. Seth thinks about how taking off the gloves will get him expelled, but decides that that isn't important now. Seth fights the electrical shock and manages to get the gloves off just in time to save Dawn. Afterwards, Seth apologizes to Yaga for breaking his rules and decides that he will just have to find another way to get to Radiant. Yaga stops him and explains that he hasn't expelled him. Yaga decides to give Seth another chance and explains that it's clear Seth managed to find the answer. Yaga gives him his old gloves, but has made them fingerless. He explains that Seth has never actually gathered Fantasia with gloves on. All he had been doing was forcing the Fantasia surrounding his arms into his gloves, which just ended up dispersing most of it. He explains that most sorcerers can't use magic without gloves, which means anyone who can do it barehanded is considered a heretic. These were the gloves given to him by Alma, and it's clear that she did it on purpose to protect Seth. With his new gloves, Seth can now make use of the abilities he was born with. And Yaga warns that training is going to get much harsher from now on. Elsewhere, Lord Majesty is glad to see his plan to have Seth stop the criminals worked out perfectly, and we see that Doc was left behind to keep working. That's all for now. If you want more, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part.